I'm Alex Ferrer. Welcome again. I have the great privilege of introducing two of our top speakers today, or during the summit. And I have to say it's a great privilege, but it was difficult to summarize their degrees and work and experience. So this is going to be a really interesting talk. Before I introduce them, I have to tell you that they just landed at 8 a.m. today. So we're really honored. I mean, we're really thankful for their effort to join us. They really wanted to share their experience here. But be kind. Remember, they have not slept too much, okay? So Suzanne Shu, she's a Dean of Faculty and Research for the Cornell University, S.C. Johnson College of Business, and also John S. Dyson Professor in Marketing at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. She has taught marketing and decision-making courses to MBA students at the University of Chicago, Southern Methodist University, INSEAD, and UCLA. She's also an NBER Research Associate, holds a joint faculty appointment at the UCLA Medical School, and serves on the Academic Research Council for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. She received a PhD and MBA from the University of Chicago. She also holds a bachelor's degree and master's in engineering master's in electrical engineering from Cornell University. I can breathe now.
Good job.
Awesome, great. She has given us amazing work, like beyond not just tools of choice architecture, which we often use to convince potential customers about the benefits of behavioral science. So great contribution. And also we have Stephen Shu. He's a professor of practice of behavioral economics at Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management, and also serves as the academic director for the CEMS Master in International Management program at Cornell University. He has more than 3 decades in industry experience and is perhaps most recognized for helping to incubate some of the very first behavioral economics initiatives around the world in the commercial sector. We actually saw a picture of him with Diego Valero earlier today. Prior to his work in behavioral economics, he ran the global career business consulting practice for Nortel and worked as a management consultant at PRTM, acquired later by PwC. He holds a PhD from City University of London, an MBA from the University of Chicago, and both a Master's in Engineering and Bachelor's in Electrical Engineering from Cornell University. Amazing.
Very nice.
Among his work also, he gave us temporal reframing to increase savings. So you might remember, because also Jose Arellano mentioned it today, which is that part in which you tell people to save €5 a day instead of 150 a month or 35 a week. That's part of his work. We also have convinced some customers to come work with us, so thank you. We probably owe you. So it is my privilege to present you to Suzanne and Stephen Shu. Please welcome.
Thank you, Alex. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having us. We are delighted to be here. And in addition to just getting off a plane this morning, this is one of the first talks we've ever done together. So we're going to see how this goes. It could go well, could be a disaster, but we're fingers crossed. So we're going to talk about behavioral economics in action, putting together the academic perspective that I'll start with, and then moving on to the more applied perspective that Steve will be covering. All of his decades of experience working with these kinds of behavioral units and companies, he's able to think through a lot of the issues that we were even hearing in the last panel of how do you get organizations to adopt behavioral science interventions and ways of thinking all the way up to a behavioral-driven organization. But I'm going to start with the academic side and take you through a little bit of what we have been working on within the academic literature within this space. Of course, you know a lot of what's already happened, and let me put up my first slide. The research literature, right, really started all the way back in the 70s. Kahneman and Tversky were doing work on heuristics and biases. An entire field of judgment and decision-making grew up around that. And from there, we started working on the idea of interventions and nudges and choice architecture, and going in and looking at very targeted problems and behaviors where we could take that list of judgment and decision-making and heuristics and biases approaches and think about, why are people making the decisions they're making? How can we maybe nudge them to make a slightly different decision? And so this is a list I like to use when I'm teaching of a lot of the different things that we know about. These are probably ones that you're familiar with on having done a lot of the readings in the space. This particular list I stole from Dilip Soman's book, The Last Mile. If you haven't seen that, that's a really nice book about that last step of implementing behavioral science in organizations and policy spaces. So I'd call that sort of nudge tools. That's the basic intervention space, and I'm going to start with some examples there. But where are we evolving to? Where is the academic literature trying to move to? I would argue that a lot of what we try to take into account now is also the situational context. So an intervention or a tool that works in one environment may not necessarily work in another environment, and we have to take a lot more of the situation into account. And then there's also another piece of that, which is that real situations, and this came up in the panel that just was talking about how hard it is to implement behavioral science in organizations, real situations are very complex, right? In academia, it's what we would call multiply determined. There's a lot of different things going on that are influencing behavior, and to try to solve that with a single intervention is often not the simplest way to do it. Academics really like studying nice, clean-cut, single approaches to psychology where we're not dealing with multiple mechanisms, but in the real world, there are multiple mechanisms. So how do we think about that? Eric Johnson's great book on the elements of choice talks about that situational context and how important that is to understand exactly the full environment that people are operating in. From there, the other piece that to me is really interesting and I think is one of the next big stages that a lot of us will be working on is bringing in personalization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment and why it's so hard to study personalized interventions. And again, going back to Eric Johnson, he's got a nice paper with Dan Goldstein and some others a few years ago in Harvard Business Review, and they talk about the difference between mass defaults, for example, and personalized defaults. So the basic concept of a default, of defaulting somebody into a particular outcome in a choice, when can you just use a one-size-fits-all, and when do you have to start to personalize it? It turns out that that personalization question is really hard to solve. All right, so let me give you some specific examples on each of these three chunks. Let me start with single goal interventions for behavioral change. This is probably what most of us are the most familiar with, right? This is what Nudge talks about. This is what a lot of the research in choice architecture talks about. A lot of the examples that we have in the literature are built around this. And here I'm talking about, we see a particular behavior from a consumer or an employee or a citizen, an individual, and we want to somehow adjust that behavior, and we create an intervention to try to get involved with that. The examples I'm going to use are from a stream of literature that I've been working on for many years now called psychological ownership, and just as examples of these single type interventions. So one that we published a few years ago was focused on what's called the tragedy of the commons. This is an idea in economics that if you have something that is publicly owned, shared ownership, it's hard to get anyone to take responsibility for taking care of it. So public lands, community-owned property, things like that, economists have written about this for years, and traditional solutions are things like enforcement and punishment, or passing laws about how you're going to take care of those public spaces. I've been doing work for a while in psychological ownership and consumer behavior, and if you're familiar with the endowment effect, right? The endowment effect says that once you own something, you value it more. We started out on working on psychological ownership saying, well, does it have to be legal ownership, or can we just have people develop some psychological ownership for an item and get something that looks like an endowment effect? This was sort of an extension of that in a really tough context where there's no legal ownership at all because it's a public space. And so by using psychological ownership and some of the interventions that we have in that space, we were able to do things like get people to take better care of a lake and pick up trash and contribute more to public spaces. So Some of the interventions that exist in that space, ideas like investing yourself in the object, having some control over the environment, and having more knowledge about it, ends up increasing psychological ownership, and we were able to show that that led to this effect of stewardship and care and responsibility for public spaces. A brand new paper that we have coming out later this year, maybe even early next year, so this is literally hot off the presses. We took it to the hospitality context and said, can we use psychological ownership in hospitality? One of the panelists that was just up here was in the real estate space, and you could apply it somewhere there too. So think about a hotel, and we actually ran a study in a hotel. This was an on-campus hotel for one of our co-authors. When people checked in, they had the choice of which room they were going to stay in, which is a little bit different than just being assigned a room. So now people have a little bit stronger feeling of ownership by choosing their own room. We then watched to see how well they took care of that room, how clean they kept it, and we found that simply choosing their own room leads to higher psychological ownership, which then in turn leads to higher room cleanliness. And we've done other things in the hospitality sector to try to show that increasing psychological ownership among guests, very simple interventions at check-in, can lead to these downstream behaviors and higher loyalty towards the hotel chain. So these types of examples, though, very one-shot, one-size-fits-all behaviors that we are trying to adjust, and we're building an intervention that we can use on anybody who comes through the door and see this behavior change. But that's a very specialized world to work in, where the behavior is so known and so particular and happens once. What if we start moving it into health? So this was, again, a one-shot decision. We were doing some work at UCLA on trying to get people to do more colon cancer screening. And again, we use psychological ownership, wording like, you have been selected. This is your cancer screening kit, right? How do you want to take care of your cancer kit? Some of these same ideas have been used in the vaccination space now, about your vaccine is waiting for you, or your flu shot is waiting for you. But again, a single shot decision, a single shot choice that we are trying to shift behavior on. Let's move that, though, into context, and I'm going to stay in that health space for a moment and talk about when we start to look at larger health problems, it gets much more complicated than just getting someone to go do a cancer screening test or take a vaccine. Now we're trying to change overall lifestyle for long periods of time. And part of the work we did in that space was thinking about chronic diseases. So think about a chronic disease, even something like high blood pressure or high cholesterol. Someone who's been diagnosed with one of those health challenges now has to change their behavior every day for multiple years and stick with it. And that's a hard thing to do, right? It's not a single shot anymore. It's getting them to do the same thing time after time after time. And because of the situational context, there are multiple barriers that are getting in the way. So we even wrote a paper a few years ago thinking about, for chronic disease, all of the different sort of heuristics and biases and things that could be going on that affect people, when you might have different types of interventions at different stages in that, and how do you get people to have sustained control of that chronic disease. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is the kind of challenge that gets really messy, and academics don't always like to try to study because there are so many things going on here, right? We can't just say we can do one thing and see that it has an effect on that choice, because now we have a lot of things that we need to intervene on. When we try to work on these kinds of problems, and we did some work with blood pressure and with weight loss and some other topics that fall in this category, we tend to take the approach of throwing a lot of things at it all at once, right? Trying to change the behavior through as many means possible. For those of you working in applied spaces, that's a luxury that you have, is that you can use multiple interventions all folded together. Academics get very nervous when we start doing that because we don't know exactly what's going on, what's the psychology there, but that's how you make change. And so some of the things we've done for healthy behavior, playing around with motivation, payment for changing outcomes, payment for changing behavior, and then finding a way to make that become a habit that people will stick with for a long period of time. All right. The last piece I want to touch on before I hand over to Steve is interventions personalized by barrier. And this is the personalization or the customization piece. And this is where things get really messy from an empirical perspective of how we test these. And let me explain why some of that is so difficult. So a big stream of research I work on is retirement income decisions, or what's sometimes called decumulation. So think about once people have hopefully saved for retirement and they reach retirement and they need to now spend down that money. It's a topic I've been working on since my dissertation days, and a really tricky topic because, again, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of psychology embedded in that. There's emotion, there's financial trade-offs, there's feelings of loss aversion. A lot of those things get in the way. The other aspect of those decisions, though, is that they have to be highly personalized. Everyone's situation is different. So on the savings side, when we're trying to get people to save for retirement, that's something that most people can get behind. They're interested in saving more for retirement at the individual, say, employee level. The employer wants them to save for retirement. The financial services companies and the banks and investment wealth management folks, they want people to save for retirement. Everybody's sort of moving in the same direction with a single goal. It makes it a little bit easier to get everyone on board with interventions that are one size fits all and increase retirement savings. On the decumulation side, though, there are so many individual differences that we need to take into account that it's very hard to have a one size fits all solution, right? We need to take into account life expectations. We need to take into account family composition. We need to take into account what kind of job the individual does. Whether they're married or not can influence some of those outcomes. So this is actually a screenshot. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that Alex mentioned that I work with in the US has a tool that I was helping them with of trying to get people to at least think about some of those trade-offs at the individual level. Given that there are more individual level influences on what a correct or a better decision looks like in this space, we have to start thinking about, should the interventions be more tailored to fit that person's needs? We can't force everyone or try to nudge everyone into doing exactly the same thing in this space. But, and this is where it gets messy, testing multiple interventions simultaneously alongside the individual differences that we need to understand to personalize those interventions from a statistical perspective is really messy. And I'll give you a specific example of that from a study that we did a few years ago that has recently been published. We were looking at Social Security claiming decisions in the US. Think of this as similar to a national or a public pension, right? It's what the US uses to help people in retirement. There are some decisions available here. The main decision is what age you want to start claiming your benefits. Do you start early at 62? Do you wait until around 67, 68? Or do you wait all the way till age 70? The amount of money you receive changes accordingly. So there's a real trade-off between the benefit size and the age at which claiming starts. And the overall finding is that most people, if we think again about the aggregate, are claiming too early. Some people have really good, valid reasons for claiming early. Maybe their life expectancy is predicted to be shorter, or they're coming off of a very difficult job and they just didn't have a chance to save much and they need to start at 62. But we'd expect that more people would start later than they do. And so we started asking the question of what kind of interventions can we try, and is there a way to match the intervention to the individual? So someone who's more loss averse, is there an intervention for them versus someone who is a high intertemporal discounter? Is there a better intervention for them? And how do we customize it in these ways? So we tested in this paper, I think it was about 13 different interventions. I'm just going to throw them up here quickly. I'm not going to go through them in much detail. We tried playing around with the framing, tried playing around with the social norms, tried messages that got them to think about their future selves, different kinds of information messages, and reflection messages. One of my favorites here is a message about regret. Think about how much you might regret this decision in the future, getting them to sort of project more. And, you know, walking into this, I kind of thought, okay, that regret one might work for people who are impatient, heavy intertemporal discounters. They don't value the future much, and I need to force them to think about the future. And maybe this intervention will work better for them, whereas maybe the framing intervention will work better for someone who is loss averse. But here's the problem. When you run a study like this with 13 different interventions and lots of individual difference measures, now you have to look at statistically the interactions of all of those, and you start running into a problem that you're testing multiple hypotheses all at once, and it raises the stakes in terms of the statistics that we need to show that it's actually having an impact. So we find that the interventions on a global scale, right, some work better than others. We find that some individual differences are more important than others. Patience is a big one. Financial literacy matters. Loss aversion here didn't matter so much, although in some of our other studies we found that it has. But trying to find where those two things link up is really, really difficult. Linnea Gandhi, who presented yesterday, she and some of her colleagues at Wharton have done these big studies on vaccinations where they can use millions of people going for flu shots or going for vaccinations and start doing a little bit more. But that's the kind of data that you need to do these kinds of projects. So it's hard for an academic to be able to get to the point where we can clearly say, yes, if you have someone sitting in front of you who is intertemporally inpatient, then you should definitely use this intervention for that client versus some other client who's going to come through the door later who's more loss averse. All right, so my quick takeaways before I hand over to Steve. We started with one-size-fits-all interventions for very specific one-time shot behaviors in many cases. We're thinking now more about interventions in context, all of those situational factors that matter, like some of the health decisions or other kinds of decisions that people are making. And then the goal that I think is super important is the personalized interventions. Testing at that scale is challenging, but we're getting better at finding big data sets where we can do it with. And this is also a space where I think machine learning and AI is really going to help us make much bigger progress than what we've been able to make in the past on building those personalized interventions. And now I will hand it over to my better half.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. So, awesome job.
Thank you.
My better
This
half.
is the one I started.
So I wanted to say, it's perfect. She overviewed the innovations in behavioral science, starting from kind of the multiple interventions, kind of moving to personalization. And so now I'm thinking about what am I going to talk about? I'm talking about like how do we get from science to business application? And I recognize that people are in different states of the journey. So the way I thought I would do this was I was going to paint a picture sort of using a time machine, going back in time to when kind of things started and take learnings from the different phases and kind of roll those together. So I wanted to start with the sort of the John Legend start a fire thing with the Nudge book in 2008. And I wanted to talk about how we had this industry evolution and how these challenges came to be and what did we do. So there was a few phases that I broke things into. One was kind of this pioneering phase. This was like right after the book started off. I mentioned the company that I worked with, Allianz Global Investors, along with Shlomo Ben-Artzi. We had a bunch of advisors along with Richard Thaler as part of the advisory board to start that kind of initiative. There were, at the time, it was kind of like a unicorn effort in the commercial space. There were a lot of public sector companies. But I want to touch a little bit on some of the things that we got from that phase. The second phase that I want to talk about was the specialization phase, which is not unlike what was seen in sort of the accountancy and the management consultancy evolution back in the 50s. When those independent organizations start off, they started collecting those experts. And we have seen a lot of things like that in the specialization. With the specialist consultancies, at one point I was keeping track of things, and the consultancies were like a third of the number of companies that were actually doing behavioral science units. During that time frame, there was also a lot of development in the universities to start these behavioral science programs. So I'll talk a little bit about that phase. And the last phase is more like this portfolio strategy, where I think at least what I'm seeing with some organizations really bringing in some things that don't necessarily come from the behavioral science space, but kind of mixing behavioral science with the management space. I think some of those things can help us kind of get to the next level depending upon where you are on your journey. So I'm going to start first with this kind of pioneering phase. So what cards were companies dealt in the pioneering phase? So the Ace of Spades is like a power card, so I did it that way. We had enablers. The book Nudge came out, gave people a language. This is something that we struggle with in a lot of companies that are starting to do things. We also had this notion of small changes can make a big difference, and so this notion of ROI was really sold to like companies. And we had examples of nudging in the public sector. What were some of the things that were weak in this case, the two of hearts? We had few role models for commercial organizations and a lack of skilled resources. What were some of these babies created during there that we want to, that came around? There was the notion of the chief behavioral officer kind of came around. I think it has taken somewhat. It hasn't fully become, universal, especially in the States, but I would say that it's still out there. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to mention was this notion of a behavioral audit, and that's the one I was going to focus on a little bit more. So the example of Allianz Global Investors, take you back in the Wayback Machine. So the business question was, how could Allianz become more relevant in the value chain? And I do a very quick tutorial of this industry. So we have Allianz Global Investors, retirement investments, right? They make these things that people can invest in. And then there's employees of companies. They sit way back in the chain here. There's plan record keepers like Voya and Prudential that provide the investments on the platform. Then there's advisors in the middle that kind of advise things to employers like Pfizer pharmaceutical companies and Publix in the grocery area, and they provide the service to employees. So the idea was to create a behavioral audit tool that plan advisors could use with employees to then basically change behavior. So they tried to work their way through this chain. So I did mention this because I think when we do these behavioral audits, sometimes we're only thinking about employees. And I think I see opportunities for companies to think more broadly about constituents that they work with, especially in the personalization phase. There's sometimes other companies that won't provide the data because they don't trust how you will use it. Well, a behavioral audit could be done on what is that process for getting them to opt into providing that data to allow personalization. So I think this notion of behavioral audits can be applied more broadly. So that was one point. The behavioral audit was something, so this is the brainchild of Shlomo Benartzi, but in essence, we tried to match outcomes and assess obstacles against them. This is not probably too foreign to folks, but I just wanted to put it up there so that we're all talking about the same thing. If we think about outcomes in this case, there were employee and employer outcomes, getting people to participate in savings, getting them to save enough, and then getting them to invest properly. And then we had these behavioral obstacles that we tiered out in terms of their power. So the inertia, getting people to either opt into the plan or make an active choice or decide that they're opt-out. People are familiar with choice architecture. That's one of the most powerful ones. So inertia was one of the behavioral obstacles. Loss aversion was another one, and myopia in the specific space is sort of how we formulated that. And we did an audit basically in 9 areas, kind of this. And so this is kind of a general framework. And I'm going to talk just about these 2, 1, and 7 here, basically. So here's just the tool, so it makes it very concrete. There was a tool, and remember, Allianz sits way back in the chain. These audits were administered by plan advisors who don't know about behavioral science. The employers didn't necessarily know about behavioral science. And then they're using with to motivate change with employees. So we had to basically create a tool that embodied behavioral finance that people who were not trained in it could use in some sense. So this tool had 23 questions asking about a retirement plan. Basically shows up how the plan stacks against measures, and then the advisor would work with the plan. So it kind of followed this 3 process. You did an audit, you had a toolbox, and you basically got a recommendation. So first question, as mentioned, I was going to cover the inertia column and basically people saving. And so there was a question about what is the initial deferral rate for folks. And we know that sometimes if there's an initial deferral rate, that can anchor people maybe anchor people too low in some case. So that was one question. Then the 7th question here was about how is the plan's fund menu presented. And in behavioral science, there's often this primacy effect where things that are first on the list are elevated a little bit in the choice. This plan particularly had they basically presented their fund in a way that, was the last fund that was in. They just decided to put it at the top, as opposed to putting the most appropriate fund for the target population there. So that was the type of audit questions. We also asked questions about the outcome scores, and basically we scored between how they were doing on outcomes and behavioral process to come up with an indicator of how they were doing on that measure. So that was basically it. And then we gave the advisor a way to kind of recommend changes in some sense, what you can do to improve your plan behaviorally and improve outcomes. And then we measured outcomes. So this was a case of where participation rate in the plan was 45% before and 87% after. Savings rates went up, not tripled, but my math is a little tough, given it. I haven't had much sleep. And then the before after kind of on selecting funds properly in some sense, all right? Okay, so I think we need to spread the news that basically the behavioral audit is something that should be liberally used. It's not used enough, in my opinion. It's something, and we often talk about experiments in behavioral science, but I think we forget a little bit and we diminish other aspects of research and other things that are non-intrusive. So I think behavioral audit is a very friendly, non-intrusive way to get started. And we should use it in more places with other constituents. All right, so the next phase, specialization. What cards were companies dealt here? More skilled resources, master's programs, there was a lot more advisors coming around, and these boutique consultancies, more proof points in specific industry areas. What were some of the downsides that we see now? These are some that I still see. Overconfidence. We can just read some popular science books and do things, and we have this transference that nudges are quick, cheap fixes, and they don't take effort. So these are some things that I do run into still quite a bit, actually, that we have to get around that kind of, we can just read some popular science books. I think I talked with at least 3 companies in the past couple of weeks, and they said, all of our people have read one book on behavioral science, and we definitely, they basically said we integrate behavioral science, right? So that was, we didn't want to probe a lot more about that, but that's kind of what some people face. All right, so what are babies that were created during the specialization phase? Thinking Fast and Slow came out, gave us a bit more look at psychology in the 2011 timeframe. We had nudge design frameworks that came out, looking specifically as the nudge as the unit of observation, making them easy, attractive, social, and timely. Frameworks like the COM-B framework came about, capability, motivation, or capability, opportunity, motivation. Change one of these levers to change behavior. I think I mention that because now you're taking behavior as more centric than the nudge. There's so many more frameworks now that are out there that take a different lens, but I do think it is important to recognize that there are these different lenses, that they're not just a bunch of different points of view. I mean, in the strategy space and in competitive space, we had all these frameworks like the 5 forces model, look at pricing, the growth share matrix, we're looking at product strategy. The behavioral science space can also have that. I think they're different lenses of looking at things, and I think we just have to take that. And then we had the behavioral sciences team, Cass Sunstein and folks that kind of came into being, and that elevated this in the United States. Okay, we became more aware of the complexity of behavioral architecture. This is a framework that I generally teach. I don't know if it's a framework, but it's the way that I organize it. Choice architecture, changing the way that choices are presented. Information architecture, changing the way that information is presented. We talk about personalization, gamification a bit, and then thinking architecture I use as a special thing because we're engaging slow thinking. And that's like a very different process, end-of-life decisions. What are you going to do in retirement? This is a very type of system 2 thinking, deep type of thinking. And so this is one framework that I teach. And then I think, over time, we've sort of built up this knowledge about, what works and sort of what is the general effect size. So I showed the previous picture here, choice architecture, and looking at this kind of meta-analysis without staring at things very deeply. Generally these changes have larger effects than information architecture. But one hidden thing under there is this whole personalization aspect, right? is that muted because there's heterogeneous things, and your main effect's going to be smaller. So I think this is something that's we've started to investigate. So I think we had behavioral economics as popular science, nudges as quick fixes. I think we have to move away from that thing, and we have to think about behavioral frameworks and lenses and get folks educated about that. And then I think we have to have kind of this respect for behavioral expertise and broader research methods, not just experimentation. I think it's sometimes a little bit dangerous. The rise of data science has become so large. It's like, we only believe in the stuff we can quantify, and we don't believe in any of this qualitative research. And I see some of that getting diminished in some companies, that having a sociology, that type of approach is very beneficial. Okay, last phase, portfolio strategy. In the introduction, I talked about like acorns. We did temporal reframing there. There's a very different type of organization than this, let's say, Commonwealth Bank in Australia. People may know that case study as well. Large bank, they have a very large unit. Chief Behavioral Officer Will Mailer's there. And so let's talk about some of the things. Portfolio strategy, what cards have been dealt? Ace of Spades, hundreds of behavioral science teams in different sectors. And we have mobility of some of the people in the field. I mean, some people have done multiple tours of duty in different organizations now. Some people have been with 3 behavioral science teams or more. What are some obstacles? Behavioral economics is a popular science. I think this organizational complexity is a big one. And then I think there's this notion of project portfolio management. How do you start and how do you glide? I'm not going to cover everything. This is a complicated topic. Everyone's been talking a little bit, so I was going to mention just a few areas. This was another organization that I worked with, Voya Financial, and they basically established the vision first. We established a vision that said we were going to work at this intersection of using science, specifically experimentation, only in the digital space, not necessarily working call centers and everything like that, and then specifically starting on retirement outcomes was kind of the focus. And so we started that, and you can imagine the organizational structure. It can, I don't know how much I'm going to go into this, but it's an overlay kind of organization, right? It's going to be some sort of organization that has this vision, has to work with the outside, has to work with product development, has to work with marketing. It's a very common thing, and probably also one of the reasons why it's more challenging to get some of these behavioral officer type roles in place than perhaps should be. So portfolio strategy was dependent on target business outcomes in here. We had things where we focused on the web design experience and things like color and language, and that we've realized that could influence things just as much as some of the more heavy lifting type of behavioral interventions. We also did things on choice outcomes, changing the default rates, trying to expand the knowledge of science. I think John Bashir's, they had done research before that can easily raise sort of the initial default rate from 3% to 6% without getting people to opt out, and we wanted to see, can it go higher? Can you go 7, 8, 9, 10, 11%? And we came up with the answer there that basically you can go higher. We start having an effect, maybe effect when you go about 11, not on this chart here, on the contribution rate, but in terms of the dropout rates, you might see a peak there. And then we started looking at this aspect of personalization. And so reducing outcome gaps between income groups. And the intervention that we used here in this case, it was based on the notion that numeracy is extremely bad in the US. I mean, a third of the people, can't do math. Maybe 2/3 of the people can do 2 operations, add and multiply in one kind of thing. It's not great. So we wanted to challenge kind of the very industry norm of I save 10%. So the notion was to do something that's more relatable, save how many pennies out of every dollar you earn. And so we did an intervention in that case and found out that those with lower incomes, less than 50,000, which was correlated with numeracy in that space, their savings rate became more aligned with what economists say they should be saving as opposed to what they were doing. So that's an example of kind of personalization. So one thing, project portfolio strategy, I think this is where I think companies can think in different ways, and behavioral scientists can think more. So I think there's this notion of having a testing platform, the notion of lab and field. I think some companies can benefit from having kind of this glide path. Sometimes we just went straight to the field, the science is super solid, and we're pretty comfortable, we have a plan. If anything goes wrong, we know what to do. Other things were more cutting edge, like reframing sort of savings rates as pennies, for example. So we have to start in a lab. We have to run 2, 3, 4, 5 labs. Now we're down, I don't know how many years we're down the road until we get into the field. But in some case, having that and having a testing platform, I think, is a useful strategy for companies to have. I think there's also a notion of having this product platform glide path. Some of the companies I go to, they talk about, oh yeah, we apply behavioral science all the time. It's only in marketing. And they haven't migrated over things to the consumer experience. Or they think behavioral science, we have to start kind of with the consumer experience, and that's like super risky. So maybe we can start easier and start with the marketing type of thing. Test things that were maybe less certain out and kind of glide out that way. And then I think there's the other thing that product companies have do is having a product line platform, kind of doing a single project. I can't remember the platform like the Volkswagen is built on, but they built a number of cars on the same chassis. You have a platform, you prove it on one platform, you kind of expand it out. That's the idea, that I think if you test something, let's say enrollment in a particular, let's say emergency savings, maybe a lot of the things will carry over to retirement savings or some of these other consumer purchases. So I think that's another way. So I think 2024 behavioral science, we need to develop kind of like this well-rounded teenager. I had this posting here from CommBank that was just posted like last week. The high points that I had was that, the people that they want to hire for these positions are people that are going to collaborate, that can work with diverse teams, that have qualitative and quantitative research backgrounds, not just this data science, number crunching thing. And they're also looking for more insight on business management. I think being well-rounded in the space, I think is going to be super important for companies to for us as an industry to get to the next level. I mean, there's something that we probably all can do. So my takeaways here, building on Suzanne's takeaways of interventions from single use to personalization, liberally use behavioral audits, practice science versus popular science. You can start with popular science, I think it's for sure, but I think that the trick we have is some people say, is it a real field, right? Is it popular science? We just read a bunch of popular science, we can do what you do. And then I think there is this notion that you have to tailor this journey. I think this is why having the specialists and the boutique consultancies and people in this room that have read the specialized teams, everyone's got to take an individual journey. There's limited off-the-rack solutions. Every now and then after the quarter or semester ends, I think about, okay, how can we scale this super large with something that I can buy off the shelf, like a suit or something like that. So that's all I had, and I think we turn it over to Q&A.
Yeah.
Right?
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for coming and for keeping the energy. Okay, so I have a couple of questions here from the audience. I have this one that says, are those individual characteristics stable enough in time to make decision how to intervene? Aren't they very context-driven and temporary?
I can take that one since I think I was the one who talked about individual differences. So we do talk about individual differences as being either stable traits that people just have. Loss aversion, we're usually pretty comfortable, for example, as being a pretty stable trait. Intertemporal patience or myopia is often a pretty stable trait. And the way we test that, of course, is we'll test it once, and then we can come back and test it months later and compare those two measures and see how much they've changed. So a lot of the individual differences we look at are pretty stable, but of course there's things that also can change on the moment and are highly situational. So, I mentioned that I do a lot of work in psychological ownership. We're actually working on a paper right now trying to understand how much of psychological ownership is sort of a stable trait. There's just some people who walk around going, I feel ownership towards everything in my orbit, all the things around me, all the things in my house. I feel really high ownership towards all that stuff, whereas someone else might be very anti-materialistic and not feel ownership towards much of anything. So we think there's some level of individual characteristic there, but really it's much more situationally driven, which is why we can do things like interventions that end up raising it or lowering it. Yeah, it's always worth checking whether the individual difference in question that you're using in an intervention or you're identifying as a behavioral obstacle is something that's coming up in that context only, or is something that we're pretty comfortable that individual is going to stay with it for a while. Even things like, let me just throw one other one out there, risk aversion. There's some beautiful research done by Elke Weber that looks at the domain specificity of risk aversion. And I think about that one a lot because in the financial services sector, there's sort of this expectation, at least in the US, that a lot of companies have to assess their clients' risk tolerance. How okay are you with taking risk? And it turns out that the difference between the risk from jumping out of an airplane or riding a motorcycle is very different from taking risk in the stock market. And yet, a lot of times people will ask those risk questions as sort of a generic, non-domain specific way of thinking about it. So yeah, it's a really important question to have to think about, is how stable is this difference that we're measuring?
Excellent, thank you, great. Well, I had the pleasure of getting to know Suzanne and Stephen and speak to them a couple of times. And I was always curious about something that I will ask you now. Sorry about that. But I'm married to a person who I was sharing a professional life with, and then we got married, and I know a lot of people around here who are, including Gonzalo. So I would like to know a little bit more about your story together. And also, how do you manage or not, or share or argue about the professional things that you are discovering and finding and so on? So can you share a little bit more, please?
You want to start? Go ahead, you can start.
You're going to set me up?
Not that
I think the last look has an
anything.
advantage here, so starting is not a good thing.
You tell me I'm wrong.
That's lesson one.
So we met as undergraduates at Cornell. And within the first few years of our relationship, wrote a master's thesis together, the Master's of Engineering that you mentioned earlier. And I think we learned what our teamwork was going to be like, our partnership in going through that process, and it turned out we worked really well together. So we've actually had careers that have been pretty parallel through most of our time together. With the exception of we both got to started our MBA at University of Chicago, and I walked into this class called Managerial Decision Making, taught by a guy in the back corner there, Richard Thaler, who will be up here in just a bit, and was captivated by this field of behavioral science. It was still relatively new back then, at least it was, a lot of the work was being done at that point in time. Nudge had not been written yet, but thought, wow, that's what I want to do with my life. So I sort of pivoted in that direction. Steve went into management consulting. But, we come home and we talk about the work we're doing. And those two things merge together, I think, at some point. And so, yeah, we do tend to work as a team. I don't know. So tell me what I got wrong there.
No, you got it all right. That's the second lesson. You got it all right. And the thing I would add is, for us, I think, when we got a little bit further apart in terms of, I was just like consulting, I was on the road Monday, making videos to my kids. This is your dad, I'm gonna be flying out on Monday, I'll see you on Thursday, or Friday morning, I guess, since you'll already be asleep. That was not really sustainable for us, being that far apart. And so I think we found some area where, we've always been kind of like a team, so I think that's one thing. But then we do some overlap, but we have kind of complementary space. I think that's the way to do it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's wonderful. I'm going to check if I think we have one more question. one or two more questions here from the audience, and we have a couple of minutes left. So, what is the most surprising learning you've had in your career in behavioral science?
Ooh, you wanna take that one?
What's the most surprising thing? I'm not sure if I can come up with one immediately, but I think, I don't want to raise this topic, so I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to have to solve. I was going to go into politics for a second. I realized I'm not going to go there.
This is when you ask your wife to go first.
I'm in the U.S., and this is like an angry area for some folks. What's the most surprising finding? I guess I guess I view this as a journey. I guess I didn't know I was going to specialize. This was like my first specialization. I decided to specialize late. Usually, I was a generalist. I worked in so many different industries. I just hopped from one thing. I had to build a competency around an area, and that was I basically helped started new initiatives. That was the common theme that I had. And so when 2009 came around, and there was behavioral science, maybe we could start something in that area. And so I think one of the biggest findings, I didn't know that there would be this John Legend moment, start a fire with Richard Thaler and Nudge, and this whole thing would kind of glide this way. So I think that's probably the surprising finding, and also surprising that there have been like different segments of the space that have evolved in different ways, and I've learned to respect those different areas more than I expected I would. I don't know. That's not really finding, but that's my discovery.
Great, thank you.
I think, yeah, and research is always surprising. Things that I think are going to work don't work, and things that I think aren't going to work do work, and I mean, that's just the joy of doing research. But I think as a field, I'm not surprised that it took off the way it did, that we can have sessions like this with so many of you who are excited about this topic. I mean, that was the feeling I had as an MBA student walking into that managerial decision-making class and going, wow, people study this. This is awesome. This explains, I've been working as an engineer for a bunch of years, right? I would see people making all kinds of crazy decisions and go, why did they do that? And all of a sudden I had a framework for understanding that. I think maybe it's not a surprise as much as maybe a challenge and also an opportunity, figuring out how to take the things we know about human behavior and make the world a better place is a tough thing to do. And I have tremendous respect for what Steve does in industry, what all of you do in industry, right? Trying to get out there and take the things that we create as academics, which again tend to be very narrowly boxed in, a nice, clean, tight hypothesis about how this person is going to do in this very particular situation, and trying to apply that to real-world problems which are messy and complicated. I'm intrigued by those really messy, complicated real-world problems. They are hard to publish in academic research journals, but that's where we make the world a better place. And listening to, for example, the last panel, that kept coming up again and again. We're just trying to make things better. And so I'm surprised and delighted all the time that we're able to work in a field that really does that.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if you have the information to answer this, but I'll ask it, what do you think about what BBVA is doing applying behavioral economics? Are you familiar with the bank, BBVA? I don't know.
I'm not as familiar as of recently, so I don't know if I can answer this, but from what I heard on the last panel, it sounded great. Do you want me to do a behavioral audit of that?
That'd be great.
I say liberally use it.
Let me see if we have one more here. Can you give more examples of how to identify biases related to specific individuals in order to design interventions in context?
We've both done a little bit of work on that. I mean, so at the end of the day, my default is really to sit down and measure it with a validated scale that we know is going to work. And for example, one that we've both worked on is a loss aversion measure. Our co-author, John Payne, developed it, and we've refined over time. You used it on some of the projects that you were working on where, just a simple set of 10 questions and we can figure out how loss averse someone is and try to customize messaging for them that way. There's some other ones. You guys were using digital measures.
So we're talking about personal, identifying individual types of biases. Oh, I see, at an individual level. Yeah, we've used things like asking them 3 questions about choosing a tax refund of this much now or tax refund this much later, and trying teasing out some sort of present bias and how large that present bias is. There's been some of that. We've also done some things in terms of stretching people's sensitivity to if risk is a hard thing. So if we do like a prospective hindsight thing, like, imagine this, you've wound up with 30% less money than you expected. What are the things you would immediately cut, and kind of tease out this kind of thing. Less of a validated scale, but more of using the principles to kind of score a person in terms of these behavioral, biases.
And if I can add just one more thing on that, and this is where I know you were sort of saying, we need the qualitative research, but on the quantitative side, back to the data analytics kind of perspective, this is where I think machine learning and big data does have opportunities, and we just haven't figured out how to quite do it yet. In the marketing literature, there's a faculty member named Joe Gladstone who did a project a bunch of years ago where he was able to use patterns of purchasing behavior and sort of use that to try to back out the kinds of biases that individuals had. And so you can imagine a world, and I don't think anybody's quite figured out how to do this yet, you could imagine a world where if you had enough data about the individuals you're working with and the decisions they've been making over time across a wide variety of domains, you might be able to identify patterns there that tell you something about their individual differences on the biases. I think, first of all, that requires a huge amount of data and very personal data, and not all organizations have that. And it requires some more sophisticated statistical and machine learning and AI type methods that we're only just starting to develop. I'm working with a faculty member at University of Pennsylvania right now, and we're actually going through online social media posts about financial decisions that people have made. So somebody put something up on Reddit about a difficult financial decision that they're facing in their home, and can we find patterns in that allow us to sort of target or separate people into segments based on the things that they talk about in something like a social media post. Again, it's something that machine learning and large language models can allow us to do, but it's only starting to be tapped into. I think it's a big open space for people to work on.
That's great. Well, thank you again. I think we're ready for lunch, and then we can come back and listen and learn how a fire started some years ago, and listen from the man himself. All right, thank you, everyone. Let's go have lunch and be back here. Thank you.